Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation this afternoon. We're thrilled to have you join us. My name is Shelley Zuckerman, and I'm the Executive Director of North York Community House. Joining me today in the presentation is my colleague, Jen Chan, who is the Innovation and Experimentation Coach at Niche, as we call North York Community House. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And just to point out that this land acknowledgement is the one that we use at North York Community House. So it's specific to Toronto. So we at North York Community House acknowledge that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. In the spirit of reconciliation, we honor Indigenous histories, worldviews, and cultures, and acknowledge the enduring presence of First Nations, the Métis people, and the Inuit people. This is our way at Niche of respecting and honoring the traditional caretakers of the land we are on. We recognize the importance of bringing awareness of Indigenous histories to our staff and community members in order to begin a journey to learn more about the truth and realities of Indigenous experiences in Canada, past and present. We hope this moves us toward relationship building and reconciliation that is defined by Indigenous people and communities. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about North York Community House, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jen, who's going to tell you a little bit more about how our workshop is going to be going this afternoon. North York Community House, or Niche, as I mentioned, is a dynamic multi-service center that has been working with residents that includes many newcomers to Canada in under-resourced and low-income neighborhoods of Northwest Toronto for 30 years. We're committed to building strong, vibrant communities, and we do this by engaging participants and residents, understanding their needs, and supporting them in achieving their goals. So I'm going to pass you over to Jen, who is going to share with you a poll and talk a little bit about how, as I mentioned, how this session will go. Thanks.
Hi there. So like Shelley said, we are going to share a poll with you now. So to be able to Sorry.
You were muted.
I was muted. Sorry.
By the house.
Okay, I'm going to start as if I was always muted. So we're going to share a poll with you. So if you haven't used one yet, you can see at the top of your screen 2 buttons, one that says stream and one that says engage. So don't worry, when you go there, you'll still be able to hear me, but you won't be able to see me just for the next little while. So if you go over to engage, then you'll be able to see our poll. So we've created this poll not as a way to gauge your innovation readiness, but as a way to acknowledge that innovation isn't clean and simple. So there's a bunch of options there, ones that we've seen happening throughout the sector, through our own staff and other innovation practitioners. And you are actually able to pick more than one option because, again, like I said, innovation is not clean and simple. So the options that you'll see there is that leadership is ready to set the tone for learning, risk-taking, and employee engagement. Staff are open-minded when it comes to new ideas and they're ready to learn. We're confident as an organization in our relationships with funders and being able to ask for flexibility within outcomes. Leadership is good at what they do. Why fix something that isn't broken? Or staff are innovated, they're over-innovated, and they're tired of trying the next new thing. And then there's also the version where we're eager to start more innovation work, but we're really not sure where to begin. So I'm just gonna give you about 2 minutes to look those over and to see which ones of those resonate with you. And what I can do is I can actually click over here, and we should be able to see people start to make selections. So I'm starting to see things move a little
cool.
bit,
Yeah.
make some changes. Yeah. That is super real time.
Yeah.
Wait, I want to take a video of that. That's really cool. So we'll give everyone about a minute to look those over. You can see that we have a little bit of a portion of people who've started to put in their responses. Okay, I'm going to move forward. I'm pretty sure you can probably keep going back to that poll if you were interested in doing that, but we're going to move forward for now. Okay, so thank you so much for those of you who got to fill in that poll. We recognize that everyone who's joining us today is probably at a different point in their innovation journey, and that's totally okay. We hope that we're still able to offer you something in the next hour or so. Here's our flow. So first, we'll have Shelley talk a little bit about what we know is that the sector is already innovative. This is not brand new, just like our session is suggesting, but then we will share a little bit about what innovation looks like at Niche, both strategically and in our programs and services, our working definition of innovation, our approach, and some of what's working for us, but what also has been challenging. I'll share a story about the innovation project that I started with at Niche, and then we'll wrap up our portion of the presentation with our lessons learned, both from a leadership perspective and also from on the ground. And then finally, we're hoping that you'll actually join us in some discussion and questions throughout the presentation. You are welcome to use the chat function. Just know that unlike a regular Zoom webinar, Shelley and I are not actually able to see the chat until after the presentation is over. So while typically as a facilitator, I would be utilizing the chat function, we actually can't do that during our presentation. But if you do want to talk to us specifically or have a question, you can use the Q&A function and we'll be able to see those. So for questions that might have quicker answers, we'll try and get to those during the session. That's something that we might be able to type and respond to. But for the longer questions that maybe involve a little bit more details, we'll reserve those for the questions period at the end of our presentation. And if we don't have time to get to something today, you can always share an email with us and we can try and follow up with you later. Okay, so now that we have those logistics out of the way, I'm going to hand it over to Shelley.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Just for you to know, Jen and I will kind of be going back and forth, so get used to it being going back and forth. So the first thing that's really important that I want to say is that I'd like to recognize that innovation is definitely not new to our sector. We've been innovating for years. All of you here and all of the attendees at the ED Forum know that well. Many staff at our organizations are developing and have developed many new and innovative programs. Organizations in our sector are trying out new program models. Most of us are engaging clients and participants in our programs and in our organizations in different ways already, in advisory committees, consultation, design, etc. As nonprofit organizations, we're continually trying to be creative and figure out how to survive and thrive in all the difficult conditions that we've experienced over the years. And COVID has shown us once again how our staff and organizations can be so innovative and adaptable very quickly. But wouldn't it be nice if we can use our innovation in a more intentional and proactive way rather than reacting to external circumstances? And how can we build on this and the innovation that we have already done and then push it further? And for us, that's part of our approach to innovation. We're in the process of developing our own kind of working definition of evaluation. So we don't have a fully formed or a really formed definition, but I want to tell you a little bit about where we're going and how we see innovation. And hopefully that's helpful as we talk about it, because, you know, innovation is one of those buzzwords that we hear about a lot. Everybody talks about it. We're not necessarily sure what it means, especially in our sector. At Niche, our goal is to see innovation integrated and embedded throughout our organization, from the way we deliver programs and services, to the way we greet our clients, to the way our staff support our community, to how our leadership makes decisions, to our strategic planning. For us, innovation can be large or small. It doesn't have to be the next new Uber for nonprofits. It can be something totally new, which doesn't necessarily happen all the time, or something that improves or enhances what we already have or do. But we have some guiding principles that we've developed and are developing when it comes to innovation. And they are to pursue large and small changes simultaneously, to be grounded in the community while thinking about systems change. We practice people-centered design, from community and clients to staff and leadership. And we believe that the trust we have with staff is returned through the trust that they build with our community members. We work to integrate an equity lens with a community development focus in our innovation work and our interactions with community members. And we really strive for the innovation to be intentional, responsive, and proactive. Much of our more recent work and learning around innovation has occurred over the last 2 years through the implementation of our Service Delivery Improvement, or SDI project, which is funded by IRCC. And several of you probably in the room or at the conference do have SDI projects and are involved in testing a variety of models. For this project, we received funding to incorporate a variety of innovation and design tools to identify and try out different ways of engaging and serving Filipino youth and their families and Arabic-speaking refugee men. For this project, we initially partnered with an external organization that specializes in innovation, but later we decided to go on our own. That's when we evolved Jen's role from working in the project partnership to her current role as innovation and experimentation coach for Niche. In this role, she would lead our innovation efforts, supporting staff and community members to learn about and try out innovation. So now I'd like to pass it over to Jen so she can talk a little bit about her role and her work.
Thanks, Shelley. So just like Shelley was saying, when I joined Niche, my role was really to be this translator or in-between person of sorts. So my role was project specific and nestled between the external design and innovation firm, and with Niche. And my role was really focused on experimenting with co-design with newcomers while simultaneously building capacity with our existing staff. So I have a background in design-driven community engagement, and I've done this work for over 10 years within nonprofits. And I was really excited to bring tools in people-centered design, participatory and community-based research, foresight, business innovation, all of these fancy things. But all these tools can support us and continue to support us in having new ideas and expanding the work we're already doing. But I also really quickly realized that I wasn't going to be able to be effective in bringing in new tools if I didn't have trust first. And so it helped that I was working alongside Shelley. So staff knew that I had the trust of leadership, but there's always the assumption that as the innovation person, that I was going to come in and tell them that the new tool was going to solve all their problems, or that I was going to be telling them that they were doing their jobs wrong because this had happened to them before. And this was not a good way to start building trust. So when I had the chance to give myself a title, I very intentionally chose to be the innovation and experimentation coach. I wanted to make sure that staff knew that I wasn't there owning innovation or that I was the only one doing it. I wanted to be making sure that my title and my relationship and my conversations with staff were remembering that they're the ones that are out in the community and that I can't do what they're doing, that I'm here to coach them, but not to replace them. So instead of starting with tools, I started with small conversations and asking staff to tell me about their work. And then as trust built, I could introduce tools to build on what they'd already been doing and what they were already telling me. So really at the end of the day, one of the strongest tools when it comes to embedding innovation tools is to start with that asset-based approach.
Thanks, Jen. You'll hear more from Jen soon around her work. It's really so interesting. So not only have we tried to support staff through Jen's role, we've also tried to support staff more strategically around innovation. So some of the ways we've done it and some of the challenges we've done it, we've had some things that worked and we've had some challenges. The senior management team has been very clear to staff that innovation is a priority, and we've encouraged and supported staff to learn about innovation and try out new ideas, working with Jen and with other resources that we've been able to have. And this has been especially so during COVID, when it's been even more important to innovate and experiment. But, and this is not rocket science in any way, but it's not just good enough to say to staff, try something out. We have to give staff time to do it and permission to fail. And this is often difficult. Frontline staff are busy. They've got a lot of work to do. Especially in these times, they're concerned about their targets, and we can't just add innovation to everything else that they're doing. So what we did during this project is we tried an option where a small group of staff would become innovation champions, and we opened it up to people who were interested in it, and then got a small group and that we would give them a couple days a week to do the innovation work and to be involved in it. And then we'd backfill their position part-time so they have the time to do this work. We thought it was a good idea. We've had mixed results with the backfilling, and I can, if somebody wants to know more about that in the questions, I'd be happy to talk more. But I think we need to try it again and figure out, maybe do things a bit differently based on the lessons learned. We see innovation as connected to our culture of learning and ongoing improvement. And we see innovation as a mindset that needs to be across organizations. As a result, it's really important that staff trust that they can experiment and failing will not reflect negatively on them. That they can try some things out, it might not work, it may work, but they would be given another chance to try something else, rather than just being seen, okay, they just can't do the job. We've also found that the manager's role is key in innovation. Even with senior management's encouragement for innovation, it won't happen if middle managers don't support and facilitate their team's involvement in innovation. So it's important to provide some training for managers. It's important to understand and deal with any concerns they may have about the innovation work, so they can then be champions in their own teams and be able to integrate that in their own teams. Jen will be talking soon about how we engage clients and participants in co-design. But in order to do this well, we also found that we need organizational systems in place that support this community involvement. And this could include setting up systems where we pay clients and community members a decent wage for their time to do this work, and that we have an equitable system to recruit community members. As I've said earlier, in addition to supporting staff and community, we're finding that innovation is most successful when it's really integrated throughout the organizations. That means that for us, innovation is one of our priorities in our new strategic plan. And we just developed a strategic plan that was passed at the beginning of the year, just before the pandemic. And we're now developing an implementation plan for it. And innovation is really key in there. It needs to, for us, it needs to be part of the recruitment of board members as we look at how board can support innovation. And based on our experience to date, we also, and we're just in the process of doing this right now, we have to identify the organizational structures needed to embed innovation long-term in our organization. And of course, the age-old question or age-old challenge around how to allocate ongoing core funding for this. So it's part of what we do all the time, and we have the resources to do it. We haven't figured that out yet. That's one of our one of the things that we are going to be trying to do. Lastly, the other thing that we're looking at doing is to try to identify the barriers at niche that inhibit innovation, whether they're financial and HR practices, funding, or operations, and then figure out ways to address these barriers. Obviously, as a registered charity, as an organization that gets government funding and funding from a variety of sources, etc., we still have to have a really strong HR, financial practices, policies, procedures, but there are some ways of and some options of looking at what we're doing and how we're doing it and make it a little easier to do innovation and also follow our practices or change our practices when needed. So I'm going to pass it now back to Jen so she can talk more concretely about what this innovation actually looks like on the ground.
Thanks, Shelley. So now you know structurally and organizationally what it looks like, but what does it really look like on the ground? So like Shelley mentioned, in 2018, Niche was awarded an SDI contribution, which is the Service Delivery Improvement from IRCC. So what that looked like is it launched a 21-month research project to learn about co-designing with newcomers. And like Shelley mentioned, we're funded to do co-design services with two populations, Arabic-speaking refugee men and Filipino youth who'd been reunified with their moms because of the Live-In Caregiver program. So I actually came onto this project in May 2019, which is just under halfway through the project. And at this point, like we mentioned, we were working really closely with an external design firm, and they were really steering the direction of the project and guiding the research project or process. But what does it mean to co-design services with newcomers? So I know that we've said that word a bunch of times, so I'm going to define it for you. Whoops. I want you to be able to look at these beautiful faces. So co-design is a participatory design approach. And what that typically means is that you're working with end users and having them as part of the design team. So to me, the core of co-designing is that we're sharing the design process, and within that, the decision-making opportunities for what the end result of whether it be a program or a service or a product or a policy, whatever that looks like, it should be influenced by end users throughout the process. So this takes a lot of relationship building, it takes patience, and it takes facilitated conversations. The goal is not to hand over all the decisions to the folks who may never have been a part of a design process before. That wouldn't be fair. but it does involve letting go of control and creating multiple entry points for ongoing feedback. So this can be different depending on how the process goes. But for our project in particular, we focused on two really specific goals and tactics for how we did that. So the first one was testing and using client-centric research. And then the other one was training and building capacity. So I'm going to talk about those two really specific goals. So our primary goal when it comes to testing and using client-centric research was to do idea generation and prototyping of new programs and services. We wanted to do that alongside end users. So in September 2019, when we decided that we wanted to move towards actually doing this work on our own, I actually took over. I was leading the project from there forward. And we took lessons learned from the research that had been done sort of in the first half of the project. And we also took the time to recalibrate. We came back and started talking with our settlement staff again about how they could see some of our research work working alongside the work that they had already been doing and seeing with their targeted populations. Probably like a lot of you, our settlement staff know their clients so well. They know their challenges, they know what's going to work, they know what's valuable to them. And we really wanted to make sure that we were touching base with our settlement staff throughout this process. So I really looked at them as an advisory and like a grounding of sorts throughout this innovation work. And so through those conversations with our settlement staff and also knowing what was available to us, the information that was available, the challenges that had emerged, we ended up deciding to develop a program called Youth Researchers. And so what we really wanted to do was create roles for the youth that we were looking at focusing on, the end users, so the Filipino young people, have them be a part of understanding and learning about their own community as a way to actually participate in designing new programs and services. So we actually hired 21 Filipino youth to be trained in participatory design and community-based research tools. So we held 2 in-person training events. This really helped us to build trust with the youth and to gain their confidence. Many of them joined the project thinking that research looked one way and that wasn't something that they ever saw a role for themselves in, let alone being a part of research that could actually help their own community. That was something that we heard over and over and over again about the impact of being a part of the Youth Researcher program, was that the youth were like, I didn't think people cared, and I also didn't think that my own story could contribute to the creation of potential future programs. So following the 2 in-person trainings, we had an all-day design lab plan to think through the development of 4 program ideas. So 3 of those program ideas that we wanted to test were actually generated with niche staff. So based on gaps that they had already seen in our existing services, they decided to focus on 3 areas. So one was pre-arrival services, one was peer-to-peer support, and then one was intergenerational supports. And what we wanted to do is take the ideas that staff had come up with and then actually test those with our end users. The 4th idea, the 4th program idea that we ended up also testing during the design labs actually came up through the Youth Researchers community-based research. So one of the things that kind of kept coming up over and over again is that the Filipino youth, when they've reunified with mom here, oftentimes the relationship between mom and dad has also been impacted by the reunification. And so divorce is actually a fairly high outcome of the reunification. But the youth were feeling like they didn't have a place to go to feel supported in what it looked like to be in a family of divorce. And so they actually also wanted to test that as a program idea. So there ended up being 4 program ideas that we wanted to bring into the design lab. Our design lab was planned for March 14th. So most of you might remember that on March 12th, the Ontario province announced that all publicly funded schools would be closed for 3 weeks. And on March 13th, Niche decided to cancel all our programs and to close all our sites. So that meant on March 13th, my team pivoted extremely fast to make our in-person design lab into an online design lab. And actually, we ultimately decided to host 2 design labs because originally our in-person design lab would have been 7 hours. And so 7 hours is far too long to spend in an intense design lab. And so we decided to break it into 2 afternoons. And we really had no time to waste going into this process. And so we wanted to make sure that those design labs were designed to be interactive, to be full of ways for the youth to be continuing to learn and contribute to the design of their program ideas. We wanted to make sure that the youth were getting opportunities to build skills that they had already told us that they didn't get a chance to build in our earlier training. So we were always constantly adapting to the feedback that we were getting from the youth researchers to make sure that the program that we were basically piloting would actually influence the development of their future programs as well. So this idea of actually building feedback and mechanisms in for how users of a program can influence a program, we wanted them to be seeing that in action. Following the design labs, we ended up extending 4 of the youth researchers' contracts to further refine the program ideas. So now fast forward to the present, we actually are still working with 3 of the 4 of those youth researchers who started their own new organization focused on supporting Filipinx youth through a mentoring program. And they've actually applied for a YOF grant with OTF, which they actually submitted a day early, which is, I don't know, kind of unheard of from my perspective. But I'm so proud of all of the hard work that they've done. And not all projects will turn out this way. Definitely not all co-design projects end up with this sort of beautiful picture finish, but it was really nice. It is really nice when they do. And I believe that this was largely attributed to the amount of trust that we were able to build with the youth researchers at the beginning of the program. And a lot of that trust was actually borrowed from our settlement workers who were able to refer youth into the program. Some of those youth they've been working with in programs or in services for over 4 years. So it was just this accumulation of so much trust and relationship being brought into the design of programs and services. And that's why, our next goal was really focused on training and capacity building with our staff to be able to build a stronger culture of innovation and experimentation within the organization. So like Shelley has said, that we already know that our staff are doing a lot. And like building strong relationships with their clients, they're also hitting their targets. They're also finding new ways now, especially to keep folks engaged. And I really wanted to make sure that I was having a good amount of small conversations with staff about what they were already doing and what they thought was innovation. So we did this with over 20 interviews with managers and frontline staff, and we built an internal innovation team, which I spoke about before, which really focused on the staff who wanted to champion and test out innovation tools with the people that they already know the best. And we really relied on their knowledge and their networks to be able to make this project a success. And the other thing that we introduced was a first ever all staff design lab. So we wanted to also give staff an opportunity to learn together. This was something that we had heard over and over again with our interviews with staff when we asked them about what was working, but what they also wanted more of. We knew that staff wanted to be able to have ways to learn about innovation tools that felt safe and see them modeled for them, but also have time to learn together with people who maybe aren't in their actual teams, but work within the same organization. And maybe some of them serve the same clients, but maybe again, they don't actually always get to work together. So we wanted to create this space for our staff to come together, to come up with new ideas that could be implemented, but may not be implemented, and really was just a way for them to learn together. So on February 27th, we transformed one of our meeting rooms into a design studio. We pinned up quotes from interviews with staff that helped us illustrate ideas and show that the staff's ideas that we were asking about them, where they were coming from, what did work and what didn't work, that all came from them. We wanted to know that they were heard. We didn't want them to feel like they had interviews with us and then we like made up a whole new thing that was unrelated to the conversations we had before. We also shared with them 5 different design challenges and worked together to brainstorm new ideas. So from those 5 original design challenges, we came up with about 12 new program ideas. And this was all within a matter of hours. And so from those new program ideas, we also worked with the staff to narrow down which of those priorities were ideas they actually wanted to try testing out with the youth. And so that's really where those 3 ideas that I mentioned before, the pre-arrival services, the peer-to-peer support, and the intergenerational support, that all came out of this design lab. So both for our staff and for our youth, our job really felt like it's our job to support their creative thinking process. And ultimately, innovation is about embedding this asset-based approach to helping to surface the things that are already there and just continue to refine and refine and refine and remind staff about how to build new ideas together, and that collaboration and that strength that comes from what they already know is what actually is making all of that possible. So I'm going to turn it over to Shelley now, who's going to start to share a little bit about some of our lessons learned.
Great. Thanks, Jen. I always love hearing you describe the work that you did. It gets me so excited. So in the past couple of years, especially of focusing on innovation, we've learned a lot. We have lots of lessons learned, both from frontline and the leadership perspective. And I'm going to start by talking about a few lessons that I've learned from the leadership perspective. And then Jen will talk about some of the lessons she learned from the frontline. So one of the things, and I've mentioned it a bit, but one of the things that's really important as a senior leader and as an ED is to have a learning mindset. I have to be, as an ED, really be open to learning new things, to admit that something isn't working anymore, even if it's something that had been working for a long time and something that we had felt very proud about. Or to admit that something isn't working well enough and it needs to be changed or done differently. I think if one thing COVID has taught us, it's the need to really experiment and learn. And that's been a really important lesson for me as an ED and as the senior person in the organization in terms of the messages that I give to the rest of the staff. As part of learning and being open, sometimes you realize that the way you're doing the innovation work may not be the best way. So not only is it the work you're doing, but as we started off the innovation work, we may realize that that there might be a need to pivot. And what I've learned is pivoting is okay. And it's often really needed, despite how scary it could be in the moment. Innovation is about being adaptable and knowing when you need to make some different choices, and then being courageous in doing it. That happened to us when we decided to end the partnership and our SDI project and make significant changes how we're going to work and what we'll do. But in the end, we did make that decision, and we do definitely feel that it was the right one to make. One of the things that you also need to be comfortable in innovation, and I think everyone does, but is around ambiguity. And ambiguity can be, comfort and ambiguity can be difficult, especially for many of us as EDs. we feel often we feel the need that we need to be in control and know what's going on. But when you're doing innovation work, often you're not sure what's going to happen. And it's often hard to live in that space. We might want more control, or we want to have a better idea of how it will turn out. But when you're in the innovation space, we don't know how things would turn out. And so we have to give up that control in order to do innovation well and to hand it over to the people that should be involved in doing the work. So I need to trust my staff and not worry about knowing all the details. I also have to trust the community. The community knows what they need and what works for them, and they need to be a critical partner in innovation work, in co-design, in research, in all the work that we do around, in prototyping, and all the work we do around innovation. Many of us in the sector, some of us in the sector, look to innovation experts to lead. And they have some good knowledge and experience and tools, but they only know so much. We as organizations, as people working in organizations, have a lot of knowledge too. Not only do we have our own experience in innovation, we know our community, we know our clients, we understand their situations, and if we've been doing a good job, we have their trust. This knowledge and connection to the community is so important. This has helped us to realize that we can have an embedded model of innovation and not rely on outside experts to do the work. So those are some of my learnings. I have lots more, but some of the key learnings that I found important as I've been thinking about innovation from the perspective of an ED. And I'm now going to hand it over to Jen to talk about her learnings on the ground.
Thanks, Shelley. So for me, being the one on the ground, when it comes to innovation work at Niche, there were a few lessons that really resonated with me too. Creativity comes from constraints. This is something that we kind of hear over and over again, whether it comes to funding or staffing or whatnot, but really at the end of the day, there's like no perfect time, place, or way to do innovation within nonprofits. There's no like recipe for it. And like Shelley said, the control that organizations want around knowing what the outcome is, because that's often what we're being asked to tell you way before it even happens, is sometimes hard because we take this sort of meandering approach to getting there. So there's always something that feels like it's restricting the ideal approach to innovation. But so rather than focus always on what's not working, even though it is important to acknowledge the challenges, it's also really important to focus on what's possible. And so with that, there's a couple things that I wanted to share. So honesty and transparency go a really long way. So the funny thing is that it often feels like folks think that the innovation people have all the answers, and this really couldn't be further from the truth. So as things are constantly changing and adjusting, it's really natural for there to be some friction. And so it's my job, especially as a coach, to name that friction, because likely if I'm feeling it, other folks are feeling it. They probably felt it long before I felt it. And so if I don't acknowledge that and I just continue to make it seem like innovation is the glossy thing that's happening on the side, I'm losing any sort of credibility with the staff and with the community. So it really helps to have that honesty and transparency and to talk those things through and to pause sometimes when that friction is happening. And that kind of relates back to Shelley's point about pivoting, is to say something feels like in my gut right now, something isn't working. How do we actually talk about this as opposed to just trying to brush it under the rug? And so also sharing as much power and ownership as possible. So like I said before, the goal is not to share all the power and all the ownership. That wouldn't be fair to the community members who are already dealing with a lot, or to the staff who are dealing with a lot. But it does mean bringing people in based on their strengths, their availability, and then being able to leverage their assets and being open to being wrong about our assumptions. Because oftentimes we're not the people who are receiving the services. So just because it's something that we think should look like one thing, we're probably wrong. And so we need to be able to be open to being able to adjust when we hear that feedback, and not holding to something that we've sort of invested our interest in. And that happens a lot in innovation. So really being able to share that power, and that kind of goes back to what Shelley was saying about control. When we don't really know exactly what's going to happen, it feels like there's some chaos happening. And so being able to create and open up those opportunities to say, okay, this is a decision I don't have to make, but also depending on how this goes, I need to be able to adapt to the decision that is made. And that sort of brings me to my last point, which is, last but not least, it's really adjusting expectations as you go. So oftentimes people like me who get into innovation type work, we're people who like to solve problems. And really when it comes to co-designing, sharing power and ownership, it really means that you're not in control. And so what it does mean is then our role becomes, how do we actually create and facilitate and document what is happening, and then document what's adjusting and how decisions were made. So it really starts to shift where our role is, away from being the problem solver to being the one who's there to support the problem solving, which is, it's a big shift even when it comes to the way in which people have always thought about innovation work. And really, we wanted to make sure that we were presenting all of this information to you in a way to hopefully spark a conversation. And so with that, I wanted to actually turn it over to all of you in the audience. So we have 50 people in the audience, and I'm sure, I'm thinking maybe you're having conversation in the chat. Again, I don't know because we can't see it. We are starting to see some Q&As coming in, but I just wanted to make sure that if you do have a question brewing now, feel free to put it into the question and answer portion of the Zoom interface, or whatever you're in, feed loop, I think. And we'll try and get to them as we can. And Shelley, I actually can see the Q&A.
Oh, good. Yeah, because we have a couple questions, which is great.
Yeah, so we do have 2 questions. Where do we want to start?
So maybe there's one to me that maybe I'll answer. The question is, I'd be interested, because I'm not sure if others can see the questions. I would be interested to hear about how IRCC reacted to your decision to hire the youth. Was this in your agreement from the beginning, or did you negotiate an amendment? So it was actually in our agreement in the beginning. Right from the beginning, we had as part of the budget to hire and pay for a couple of youth researchers, and some and money to backfill for what we called adult researchers, just to make the difference between youth and adults. Some backfill money to hire staff that would backfill for the staff that were going to be our ongoing staff that were going to be involved in innovation. But later on, when we decided to go from 2 to 21 researchers, we did have to get IRCC's okay on that. And they were okay with that, as long as, we gave them a good rationale, and they were okay with that. Do you want to?
There's 2 other questions. So there's one around, did you hear correctly that you started the project with Arabic and Filipino community? So yes, we're focusing on those 2 populations, right?
Yes. So we had, right from the beginning with the SDI project, we had identified that those were two communities. We had started with Filipino youth who had been reunited with their parents, and Syrian men. And those were two communities generally that we felt that we were seeing a lot of people, and we felt that our kind of current models and our current work, that we weren't able to engage them as well as we would like, and that some of the programs that we had didn't necessarily, weren't necessarily kind of appealing to them. So that's why we chose those two groups. And then from Syrian men, we kind of went a little bit beyond that to Arabic speaking refugee men. But in reality, we did more work with the Filipino community than with the Arabic speaking men. We did research with both, but when it came to some of the co-design and the prototyping work, it was primarily with the Filipino youth. I think there's another question.
There is, but I asked a clarifying question. So there was a question that says, can you give us some examples of your innovation changes or improvements in settlement services? From Adriana. But I've asked if they can clarify what they mean by innovation changes or improvements. So
and please add more questions. We're happy to take as many.
I also can go back, because I'm sort of curious about going back to the poll results. Do we want to do that right now? Just because I know that that was like a brief moment in time. I feel like folks might be interested in that data. Oh, I think maybe Canada might be doing that for us. Okay, there is another question. So Adriana's clarification was, what was the result of your innovations?
Okay, Jen, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I think like, especially for the youth researchers, it really came down to the confidence they had to be able to start their own project. So over the summer, even though our project ended, so our SDI actually ended in June, I actually carried on working with the youth to refine their ideas. So we had this moment where we said, okay, you can either decide that you hand over back all of the program ideas to niche staff, and as an organization, we try and decide, how are we going to implement the program ideas that you have helped to create, which were all really interested. They were all informed by the users. Most of them had participated in a lot of other newcomer orientations, whether it be at school or through their faith-based group. But they were really feeling that like they were missing this youth-led and especially culturally youth-led approach to running an organization or participating in a program that was infused with that thinking. And so they decided, instead of handing over all of that information, they wanted to try actually learning how to run their own organization. So we know that that's not an easy thing to do. And so we wanted to make sure that we supported them through that process. And so I continued to coach them through the summer, and they ended up developing leadership around, okay, what does it mean to run their own organization? What would we need to do? How do we actually gain credibility as a brand new organization? And so really by the time that they got to applying for YOF, we had several coaching conversations, and that's really been the baseline of our stewardship, is like trying to figure out if we're going to include more community members in co-designing, what is the sort of pathway, so to speak, for that process? So when we've engaged with youth or newcomers in a program or service, or community members, when we've engaged with them previously in something where they're sort of receiving programming from us, moving towards a place where they're actually involved in a conversation of co-designing something. It doesn't always end in leadership, but it might. And so how do we actually continue to build the sustainability of that through our work. And so I think there is a lot of like just confidence building, relationship building. The other thing that I think was a really big impact, which was kind of COVID related, which was we were continuing to meet during COVID. And I think for them, they were like the stability of continuing to meet with a purpose of creating an organization felt really productive to them. And I think that that's like all a part of this journey of innovation, is that we as an organization don't get to decide exactly how it turns out, but it's our job to be there to support the folks as they're in the process. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, we do have some other questions.
Yeah, we have. So there was a question about sustainability, and how do we get it sustained past the project period? That's obviously a really big one and an important one, and one we're challenged by. We were lucky that we were able to find bits of money here and there, not through IRCC, but through other funding, to keep Jen on past the SDI project. And right now we'll have her on till the end of March. But after that, we don't have the funding. So we're trying to figure out, I guess, a couple things. One is internally, we're trying to figure out how we do this and where can we find money, whether it's through some new projects or through fundraising or through taking a bit of our core funding from United Way or somebody else to do that. We don't really have the answer, but I think we also need to do more advocacy with funders. With the SDI, the IRCC funded a lot of SDI projects. And even though there's another round of SDI, they're not necessarily connected to the original SDI projects. So across the country, we've come up with all kinds of great models of new programs and new ways of service delivery, and there isn't the money for it. So I think we need to do some work around advocating with IRCC and other funders to invest more in innovation. It's not a great answer. I don't have a magic bullet. We're trying to figure out also internally, how can we give some time to staff if we don't have money for backfilling and other things? How can we, make changes to their jobs and that so they do have time? And we haven't figured that out yet, but we're working on it.
So we have a couple more questions. There is one around, hi, Joanna. Joanna's asked, what would be the advantage of having the structured innovation approach over a more organic approach that we usually use? So Joanna, when you say structured, I would say I think you can always have sort of a plan in place. I think definitely going into the funding, you say we're going to spend about X months doing research. And while we're researching, hopefully what we'll learn from that is some things that will feed into the idea generation. And from idea generation, that will feed into prototypes. And this is all in the assumption that you've also figured out how to do co-designing, because sometimes those things don't happen at the same time. Innovation doesn't always happen in a co-design process, so we should be clear about that. So sometimes you might be doing it in a way where you might be getting informed, you might have interviews or something with community members or have conversations with your own staff, but you're not really involving them in the actual decision making of how things happen. So then that would be two different projects. But I would say if we are doing it in the assumption where you're doing co-design and you are involving your end users in your innovation process, again, that structure needs to be loose enough with enough guidance from someone like me to say, okay, this is where we think we might go. And then as we're going, start to notice when things are working and not working and then readjust. So I think that you can't, if you try and have a too structured innovation approach, you're more likely going to fail or just end up doing more of what more of a scientific approach where you've basically tried to come up with a hypothesis at the beginning of the project and you're just trying to prove that, as opposed to really being organic within the results. Whereas I think what you're saying, organic in the approach where like maybe it's not even pre-planned, like it just happens because something happened. I think that it has its pros and cons, because you maybe are doing it off the side of your desk, or you might have to change priorities if you haven't really carved out the time to be intentionally innovative. Maybe I'll say intentionally instead of structured.
One thing that I'm not sure, again, whether this was part of the question, but I'll kind of give you my perspective from a leadership perspective. You know, I said right at the beginning, I started the webinar by saying we've been innovative for years, and that's very true. But I think part of the difference in our approach, and we're just figuring it out too, is that we're trying to be more intentional in terms of saying, okay, if we want to integrate innovation across the organization, what do we need to do differently? What do we need to change? It's not just a matter of saying, okay, we're going to figure out a bunch of innovative programs, try to find money for it and do it. But how can we as a whole organization be innovative? And I gave, you know, some examples of some of the things we're trying to do. What are some of the barriers that we have to deal with? What are some of the what are some of the learning and some of the training and coaching that staff need? How do we work with the community differently? How do we give people time to do this work? All those things. So for us, we're trying to make it very intentional and trying to figure out how best we can integrate this. And again, we're fairly early. I saw another question about backfilling. In the original project, the idea was that we would choose about 4 staff and a few community members, whether they were youth or adults, and they would be, it was called the crew. They would be the group that would do the learn about innovation and work with the organization that we partnered with, and with the person who kind of managed the project, which was Jen later, and we had someone else earlier. So what we did is we had gotten money, as I mentioned, to hire people to backfill the position. So we opened it up to the staff and asked people if they were interested in being involved in the crew, and it was for a period of time to begin with. And those who were interested, the project met with them to find out more about what they want to do, etc. And they chose 4 people. And then what we did is, for those 4 people, we kind of worked with those 4 people to figure out how best to backfill their positions. And it wasn't, you know, so if somebody was a youth, we had somebody who was a youth worker. We tried to find somebody who could do some of the youth work for a couple of days a week. What we found it's difficult to do it that way. That backfilling is really good in terms of having the money available, so that we can say to staff, hey, you don't have to, you can only work you don't have to work more than 3 days a week on the work you're doing. You can spend 2 days in the innovation work. But it's really harder, as you can imagine, harder to do it because people have relationships with clients, they have programs they need to do. And we found that our staff overall were a little reluctant to give up some of their work, give up some of their clients, not give up their clients, but transfer kind of their clients to somebody else, etc. So that was our experience. I think there's still probably maybe better ways to do backfilling, or better ways of finding the time for staff to do this work. But that was our experience.
So Michelle, who's in the audience, has so graciously started taking questions that are in the chat and putting them into the Q&A for us.
Oh,
because,
great.
like I mentioned, we can't actually see the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So there's 2 new questions there. Do you want to just take a chance to read those over and see if there's one? So if there's one you want to take a stab at first.
So there's one about from Ermi about how SDI projects changed how niche approaches innovation. So I think we've talked a bit about it. I'll talk about it and then let Jen. I think one of the things that was kind of important for us is sort of at the beginning of the work, we heard from a lot of innovation people that, and definitely with the partners that we initially worked with, that social service organizations or organizations can't really do innovation and integrated. We need some outside structure to do it, whether it's another organization or whether it's some structure that you kind of develop internally and put out externally, like some, you know, some big companies like Google has an innovation unit or whatever that is. One of the things that we learned through this process is that we can do innovation internally. It would look differently. It could look differently, but that we can do that. So it kind of confirmed to us, because initially we really believed that, and then we were sort of doubting ourselves. But it does take resources. It does take, as I mentioned, the need to look at different barriers to innovation. So we haven't yet, well, we've done a bit of work around changing our policies. We haven't done a lot of work yet, but we're kind of in the process. We've kind of developed some new ways of, when Jen came to our HR director and said she wants to hire 21 youth and wants to do it right away, our HR director kind of was like, oh my goodness, like, and yes. So over the time, we've figured out ways of doing that is consistent with good, you know, with HR laws and legislation and everything, but and it's fair, but we don't have to go through a whole interview process with and posting process, like full posting. So we've kind of, I think that's been a really helpful piece. So it's one example. We have lots more to do, and we're just in the process now of identifying more barriers, but I think that's a practical one. Jen, you may have other examples.
Yeah, our HR loves me. They love when I come calling, because I'm always like, so do you think we could do this instead of this? But actually, so this actually ties really nicely to Mike also asked a question about, you mentioned that your organization had split up from a previous one to focus on innovation. Do you think that multi-service organizations should set up a position or department dedicated to this? So I think, like Shelley's been saying, we are now sort of focused in on embedded innovation and what it looks like to have that internal role, so my role, and that I think partially that happened because of what happened with the organization that we were working with previously, but it might have evolved that way anyway. There's obviously pros and cons, I think, to having an internal innovation person versus hiring a whole outside organization. So because I previously was working in both sort of situations, when we were working with the external organization, they had a whole team of designers and service designers and researchers and like lots of people that were focusing on our work. And so, but every time I would go to them with something, it would come back and I'd be like, I don't feel like we're having the same conversation. Like, so when I was having the conversation internally with niche, I was really able to focus it in on what niche wanted. It was about our needs versus the external organizations thinking about what innovation should look like inside of our organization. And I think that, like, it was two really different values-based approaches to the work. And so I think that there's always pros and cons about having that position set up. I will also say there are times where, I do feel like I'm coming to HR being like, I know we've been doing things like this way. Do you think it'd be possible if we did things this way? And I have to present a case as to why. So like Shelley was mentioning, when we hired 21 young people, typically when you're hiring people, you would interview all of them, you would do reference checks, you would do all of these things. And because they were coming into a job program hybrid, we were able to say, okay, instead of doing all of that pre-admin work, we'll actually use the first training session sort of as an interview. And so I think it is starting to evolve how we think about those relationships with people when they're not fitting into the same boxes that we maybe always had them fit into before. I hope that answers those questions. And then we now have another question from Laura. Thanks, Michelle, for transcribing all the questions. Interesting presentation. We're doing something very similar at the time, and we'd be interested in knowing if you encountered any surprises from the data/feedback you gathered from youth, and how did the funding to backfill positions happen? So Shelley, I think you already talked a little bit about the backfilling of the positions. It was already in our original application, and then we also globbed together some funding to sort of make it so that we could actually hire the full 21. So I should also add that when I said we were going to hire 21 staff or young people, I also had an assumption that as we were going through the program, that the 21 wouldn't stick with us. I was like, okay, so we'll have 21 for the first session, and then by the second session, I was expecting there to be like a drop off, that like each session that we had with them, that less and less of them would come. So technically the budget would be less than if all 21 stayed engaged the entire time. So as innovation goes, expect the unexpected. Most of the 21 stayed engaged the entire time, which actually was really great in terms of engagement, but it also meant that our budget was higher than I had originally proposed to our finance team when I was saying that, oh, it's fine, we can hire 21 because I only think like 15 or so will stay engaged. And so that ended up being a little bit of a dance of finance towards the end. But I think it really was important to have allocated funds. And I think that is something that we've really learned, is to value the people who are contributing for their experiences, because there's really no other way to get that experience than them having lived through it. So I really think it's important that we are actually able to create jobs or roles or pay for people to contribute in that co-design fashion. So I think if you are going to be doing co-design, to make sure that you're doing that to create that equitable access, so that we're not only creating volunteer positions for people to give us all of their information about their lives that we really couldn't get any other way. And I think in terms of surprising data or feedback, I think because of the relationships that we built with the young people, they were telling us lots of things that were happening that they probably had told settlement workers too, and were related to what we were talking about. But sometimes they were just telling us things about like something that had happened to them 3 years ago at school that we like couldn't really support them with, but we had built that relationship. So I actually think that like a lot of what was surprising to me was how much trust we were able to build that quickly with the young people. And then there were things that were like really disappointing that we were hearing. So like, for example, I had learned from one of our young people that when he first came to Canada, that he was put into academic math, which essentially meant that if he had stayed in, not academic math, the other one, applied math. If he had stayed in applied math and never advocated for himself, which he ultimately ended up doing, he never would have gotten the opportunity to go to university. So that was something that we learned about, that we didn't get to spend a whole lot of time finding out if that happened to lots of people. But it was one thing that we learned about in terms of how much the youth that we're working with have to advocate for themselves. So I would say that if we were to do another version of this project, that's something that I would be interested in, but it's something that we sort of ran out of time on based on our existing innovation project.
Just one thing to say around the funding. We actually found overall IRCC to be, as long as we gave them a good rationale, to be pretty good around allowing us to move the funding around a bit. I mean, it was all in one category, so it was easier, but they were pretty good and pretty open, and we had several requests over the last 6 months in terms of moving money here and there, and overall they basically pretty much allowed everything.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So we don't have any more typed questions. Michelle, are there any more typed questions in the chat? If anyone else has more in the Q&A, I think, and we've been notified that we have just under 15 minutes. We have about 10 minutes left. Thanks, Michelle. Michelle says there's no other questions in the chat. Madeline has just asked, she said, this is not a question. Just wanted to say how much I appreciate you highlighting all the self-advocacy that clients do. This is so true and would be interesting to look into more. Absolutely. I think for the young people, the amount of self-advocacy they're doing in a system that they and their parents have no knowledge of, it was, like I said, heartbreaking.
Just before we leave, I think there's one thing that I want to say that I think is people have asked about the kind of the impact of the innovation. So as Jen said, the last part of the work, or the last few months of the work, were right in the middle of the pandemic, or started the pandemic and into the pandemic, and so some of the things that we wanted to do with, some of the more design labs with staff, and, some of that had to change. But one of the things that I think is a factor, one of the things we were so pleased, and I think this is the case with so many organizations, we were so pleased with how adaptable our staff were and how we were able to transition to online programs in middle of March when we had to close our offices, and how staff were quite excited. I mean, it was, on one hand, it was horrible and there were so many horrible things that happened, but we're also quite excited about trying out new methods of program delivery. And I think part of that was as a result of some of the innovation work and some of the support that we had been providing them, and some of the things we talked about, and some of the tools we had, got them engaged in and stuff, where they kind of felt more confident around innovation and around adapting to situations. And so I think that was one of the factors that helped, in addition to other things. But just wanted to say that in terms of the pandemic, because obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic, and a lot of what we were talking about happened before, but there's impact on what's happening now too.
Yeah, just to add to that, I would say that, so while we're no longer working on the SDI project, I am working on other projects. And so with that, we've taken a lot of the lessons learned of how do we integrate staff into the process? How do we create roles for them? And how do we integrate community members? And we're doing that in all sorts of different ways, still with lots of lessons learned and things that have room for improvement. But I think that one of the things that is happening for staff is that I'm engaging with staff around their own programs a lot more, and saying we tried out this one tool during the youth researcher program. I think it might be something that you might like to use in your own program. And so I actually can talk them through how a tool worked. I can give them the templates, and then when they go and use it, I can actually coach them through using it. So it actually makes the implementation of a new tool fit with some of their existing work. And I think that feels so much more authentic than just introducing random innovation tools that are unrelated to their work. There's no value to them for that new tool necessarily at that time. So I think it's also knowing that there are so many tools and there's no real one size fits all. I wish I could see the chat. I hope you're all chatting with each other.
Yeah, I don't know. There's, I think, another question. I just saw it.
Nope, it's just Joanna saying thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Joanna, for using the Q&A as chat.
Yeah, no, it's thank you for attending. I think I'm not sure if there's an evaluation that goes up or something that happens near the end, but I want to thank you very much for attending our session today. And I think there was a question about at way back about sharing some of our material.
There was a question about sharing tools or resources that came from the work with the youth researchers, I think. And I had offered that person could send me an email. So I will say that anybody who has lingering questions about the work or want to know about really specific tools that we used, you can send me an email. My email is jchan, C-H-A-N, at niche, N-Y-C-H, .ca. I'm like, now I wish we had a slide that said that. But you can email me. And there is also a webinar that we recorded right before the end of the project, but it was in May, that you can find on our website. I wish I could send it. I can try and find it. That actually talks about a little bit more about the SDI project, but also the best part is that you can hear from 4 of our youth researchers about their experience. So if you don't have time for the whole hour and a half, just fast forward to the part where the youth researchers talk, because it really is amazing about it really is about like the impact of the program on them.
Okay, great. So I think I haven't heard anything that I know in other sessions an evaluation would pop up, but I don't know if we have one for this, but if we don't, I think we'll
I think I can send a message to the attendees, but I can't see anything they type. So I think I've sent a webinar link, and then I will also send my email. Okay.
Okay, I see a couple questions, but I don't know.
No, it just says it has popped up automatically.
Oh, okay, great.
And thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for attending today. And as Jen said, if we're happy to provide you with more information or talk to you more if you have any questions. So, so feel free to get in touch with Jen. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.